VPRO's Thema vertoont vanavond een documentaire over de moeizame weg naar de gezamenlijke Europese munt. Een Engels programma gemaakt in coöperatie met meerdere omroepen, waaronder de VPRO. Kijkt u naar De Wisselaars, waarom de euro er moest komen.
When this pageant was celebrated in 1549 in Brussels in the presence of the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, Europe's courts and armies were paid for with over 300 different currencies. Next month, European Union heads of government meet here to decide which countries will adopt a single currency, the euro.
Es ist unser Interesse, nicht vom amerikanischen Dollar allein abhängig zu sein. Es ist unser Interesse, dass eine europäische Währung mit gleichem Gewicht auf den Märkten der Welt auftreten kann und auftreten wird, wie es der amerikanische Dollar hat.
For over 25 years, German chancellors battled with opponents in the Bundesbank to force through economic and monetary union, EMU. Their unstated aim was to tame German aggression by locking their country into Western Europe. Even more eager to restrain Germany, French presidents too worked to create a single currency.
Ce sera vraiment la monnaie de l'Europe. Eh bien, cette monnaie de l'Europe sera, au point de vue des transactions commerciales, la première du monde.
Britain, less fearful of Germany, steered an erratic course. Right at the start of economic and monetary union, Heath took Britain in, then out again. Callaghan kept Britain out. Then Thatcher took her in. Then Major took her out. But in Paris and Bonn, the momentum towards the euro had become unstoppable. The story of European monetary union begins 6,000 miles away in Vietnam. In the 1960s, America's leadership of the West's armed forces reflected her economic dominance. By herself, America produced 1/3 of the world's industrial goods. Most international traders quoted prices in dollars. Most currencies were pegged to the dollar. The currency system had a twin base.
Der Dollar war die strahlende Sonne, aber gleichzeitig wollte man sich nicht darauf verlassen. Die Menschen wollen irgendwie etwas Sicheres haben. Gold ist immer etwas Sicheres. So wurde der Dollar an das Gold gebunden, um Vertrauen zu schaffen.
For 20 years after World War II, paper dollars were as good as gold. Then a hostile French president levered the two apart.
Et oui, l'or, qui ne change pas de nature, qui peut se mettre indifféremment en lingots, en barres, en pièces, qui n'a pas de nationalité, qui est tenu éternellement et universellement pour la valeur inaltérable et finie.
De Gaulle wanted to assert France's status as a great power. In 1967, he told America to take her troops out of his country.
General de Gaulle's foreign policy was strategically designed to diminish American domination in Europe. And in that cause, he certainly would have wished to take the dollar down a peg or two.
America's free-spending ways gave de Gaulle his chance. She had over 400,000 troops in Vietnam, on top of the 300,000 she kept in Europe, mostly in Germany. Americans were spending abroad over $3 billion more than they were earning.
Well, generally speaking, our balance of payments has had a deficit for the last 17 out of the last 18 years. The first 3 quarters this year, that deficit was within bounds. The last quarter, it goes farther than we would like to see it go.
America's dollars, recklessly printed to buy goods from her allies, fetched up in Western banks. Their value became suspect.
On a considéré qu'à partir du moment où il y avait de plus en plus de dollars dans les réserves des banques centrales, il fallait que le stock d'or détenu par les États-Unis risquait de devenir insuffisant.
There was a sort of an unwritten agreement that most governments would not press the dollar claims against our gold stock.
But this unwritten agreement fell foul of de Gaulle's ambitions for France. For the first time since World War II, a European power challenged America's financial dominance.
J'ai entendu le général de Gaulle s'adresser au ministre de l'économie et des finances d'alors en lui donnant l'ordre, dès que toutes les dettes de la France envers les États-Unis auraient été remboursées, et cela allait arriver quelques mois plus tard, dès ce moment-là, de demander aux États-Unis le remboursement des dollars en or.
A French representative came in to see me and said that France wanted to exchange, I think it was $300 million for gold. This was not what I would call a friendly gesture.
From Fort Knox, the Americans had to hand over to France the gold she demanded. Then other nations joined the queue.
La motivation de ces pays était essentiellement fondée sur la crainte de voir les réserves de change, leurs réserves de change compromises. Et ils pensaient qu'il était plus sûr d'avoir un peu plus d'or et pas seulement du dollar.
By March 1968, the raid on Fort Knox had taken over a third of America's gold. Devaluation threatened the dollar. France had brought the American giant down on one knee. Now Germany was to force her down on the other and open the way to EMU, a European system that would not rely on the dollar. The contest began in November 1968. Germany's export trade was flourishing. Most banks and finance ministries expected the German government to raise the Deutschmark's rate against the dollar. Revaluation. Holders of dollars began switching into Deutschmarks.
Ich sah damals im Wirtschaftsministerium 1968, als ich abends immer die Bundesbank anrufen musste, um für Minister Schiller einen Devisenbericht zu machen, dass für damalige Zeiten Riesenmengen an ausländischer Währung zur Bundesbank fluteten.
Chaos overwhelmed Europe's markets.
Innerhalb kürzester Zeit, innerhalb von 3 Tagen, strömten 1,8 Milliarden Dollar nach Deutschland, rein spekulatives Geld, weil die internationale Finanzwelt annahm, wir würden aufwerten. Und man wollte natürlich dann dieses Geschäft sich nicht entgehen lassen, noch Deutschmark billig einzukaufen und nach ein paar Tagen sehr gut wieder zu verkaufen.
We got more news about money pouring into Germany, into the Bundesbank. It seemed that the situation was developing that was more deeply in the form of crisis than we had expected.
Es hat verschiedene Signale gegeben, insbesondere auch von amerikanischer Seite, wo man sagte, ihr solltet eigentlich im allgemeinen Interesse, solltet ihr aufwerten.
The German-American championship bout got closer. 2 officials from Washington had been having routine discussions in Rome. The senior was Henry Fowler.
Secretary of the Treasury Henry Fowler and I were on a farewell trip to Europe. This was just to say goodbye to people we'd been working with for 4 years.
By chance, the Americans arrived in Bonn just as the flight from the dollar reached its peak.
We went over about 10 o'clock at night to see the German finance minister, Strauss, and the German economics minister, Schiller.
The Americans told the Germans they must revalue. They saw this as the only way to calm the markets and stop the run on the dollar.
Unternehmer Banken, Gewerkschaften waren dagegen, weil sie fürchteten, dass sonst die Arbeitslosigkeit steigen würde durch Erschwernisse der Exporte. Wenn man sieht, dass in vielen deutschen Unternehmen, zum Beispiel Volkswagen, über 50–75% der gesamten Produktion exportiert wurde, war dies ein wesentlicher Faktor. Das war sozusagen die Lebenslinie für Deutschland.
Volkswagen was selling nearly 500,000 Beetles a year in the USA. Raising the marque's value would make them more expensive than their American competitor. "24 desperate hours now began that would break the dollar-based system and raise the flag of EMU. Germany hit back at America's demand for revaluation.
Ich habe es dann sehr prononciert auf der Pressekonferenz noch einmal deutlich gesagt,
die Bundesregierung wird die D-Mark nicht aufwerten.
Treasury Secretary Henry Fowler thought assembling a group of America's allies in Bonn would force Germany to revalue. He put pressure on Economics Minister Karl Schiller.
Herr Fowler nutzte die Gelegenheit seiner Anwesenheit in Bonn und hat bei einem Gespräch im Bundeskanzleramt zu dem Wirtschaftsminister gesagt, Karl, Sie müssen sofort eine Zehnergruppensitzung einberufen.
The problem, as we saw it, was quite simple. We'd been away for some time and we wanted to go home. We were staying at the ambassador's house and we wanted to get out of his hair.
Schiller did not want to cross swords with America over the mere holding of a conference. US troops were protecting Germany from the Russians.
Schiller stand hinterm Schreibtisch auf und sagte, Kinders, jetzt müssen wir ran. Wir müssen eine Konferenz einberufen, sehr schnell, morgen Nachmittag.
Bereiten Sie alles Nötige vor, kümmern Sie sich um die Konferenzsäle, um die Fahrbereitschaft, um die Telefonate, um die Fernschreiben, die herausgegeben werden. Die Telefonapparate reichten gar nicht aus, um alle Anrufe zu machen. Und es wurde Dolmetscher immer wieder gebraucht für einige Einladungen.
Es mussten Tischtennistische in den Keller gestellt werden und lange Tischtücher gesucht werden, um das zuzudecken. An den Tag jagte alles durcheinander.
Within 3 hours of giving in to Fowler, the German government invited to Bonn 9 countries, including Britain, America's principal ally in NATO. Britain's reserves, like America's dollars, were draining away to Germany. The Chancellor of the Exchequer faced a crisis that would dog many of his successors.
We were advised by the Bank of England and by Treasury officials, indeed, that we were in a very vulnerable position.
The markets were in turmoil. The pound was under enormous pressure.
Britain did not like playing second fiddle to Germany. As dawn broke, the press was flashing news of the emergency conference summoned in Bonn. Jenkins set off, unlike some delegates, to the right airport. The tough-talking Americans had flustered the Germans out of their normal efficiency.
Es wurden Dienstwagen geschickt, um Teilnehmer in Frankfurt abzuholen, aber die Teilnehmer landeten in München und mussten von dort dann mit dem Zug oder privat angemieteten Wagen nach Bonn kommen und kamen sehr ungehalten, übermüdet und zu spät zur Konferenz.
It was a badly organized meeting, in my view. It was, I think, the worst conference I've ever attended.
That afternoon, scores of journalists watched finance ministers and central bankers arrive at the Economics Ministry in Bonn. The resistance to America was to be led by Germany's Karl Schiller.
Schiller was one of the worst chairmen I've ever encountered, and he did suffer from a sort of verbal diarrhea.
I'm always optimistic, but it's very difficult, and it may be that there will be, in between,
Chairman Schiller must have spent a quarter of the time of the meeting in giving economics lectures to his colleagues.
Les Allemands ont plaidé, et ont dit d'une façon très catégorique d'ailleurs, qu'ils n'allaient pas réévaluer ce que d'autres leur recommandaient.
Und es war ein gängiger Slogan, warum soll der Gesunde sich kurieren, anstatt dass der Kranke sich kuriert? Und wir meinten, dass die D-Mark gesund ist und dass der Franc und das Pfund und der Dollar krank sind.
After riots in France, the franc had joined the currencies on the sick list.
The Minister of Economics, Schiller, said that the franc could be devalued, the pound should be devalued, and the dollar should be devalued.
Monsieur Deming est un homme que j'estime beaucoup. Il était dans une situation difficile parce qu'il faut bien reconnaître que la puissance monétaire qui apparaissait dans cette réunion, c'était essentiellement l'Allemagne.
The Germans dug in, and so did the Americans.
Minister Fowler hat nicht ökonomisch argumentiert, sondern astronomisch argumentiert. Er hat gesagt, der Dollar ist die Sonne und die Sonne verändert sich nicht. Wenn sich etwas verändert, dann müssen es die Planeten tun.
Monsieur Fowler a dit ce qui a toujours été la position américaine, le dollar est au centre du système, c'est à vous de vous adapter. C'était leur formule, it's up to you. Et les autres disaient, nous voulons bien nous adapter, mais ce sera inutile, tant que vous, Américains, vous n'aurez pas pris les mesures nécessaires.
This was the turning point. By persisting in her refusal to revalue, Germany was leading the countries of the European community in challenging American dominance. The dollar could no longer be the linchpin of their currency system. The decline of the dollar led the European Commission to mint a revolutionary new idea.
J'ai proposé d'avancer progressivement par une réduction des marges de fluctuation vers une monnaie unique.
All European currencies would be merged into a new one. It was to be 30 years before this became the euro.
Die Rolle einer europäischen Währung sollte erstens mal den Binnenmarkt vereinheitlichen helfen und sollte auf den Devisenmärkten ein starkes Gegengewicht gegen den Dollar darstellen, dass die einzelnen europäischen Währungen nicht mehr so stark vom Dollar dominiert würden, wie das bisher der Fall war.
But this idealistic scheme was for the future. At Bonn, immediate problems took precedence. As the Germans would not revalue the mark upwards, pressure grew on the French.
Die Mehrheitsmeinung in der Zehnergruppe war, dass der französische Franc abgewertet werden müsste.
Monsieur Schiller et Monsieur Strauss prenaient des positions qui, dans certains cas, ont été considérées par les autres pays comme arrogantes.
Les Français disaient non, nous ne voulons pas dévaluer, ça n'entre pas en ligne de compte. Notre président, le général de Gaulle, a créé le franc fort et aussi politiquement, il serait insoutenable d'évaluer le franc français.
Die Konferenz wurde zeitweilig mehrere Stunden, zweimal mindestens unterbrochen, weil der französische Finanzminister Ortoli gerne in der französischen Botschaft telefonieren wollte. Er hatte Misstrauen, dass das Telefon im Wirtschaftsministerium abgehört werden konnte.
The French finance minister's words at the conference led German delegates to believe that France would devalue.
In diesem Verständnis, dass eine Abwertung Frankreichs durchgeführt wurde, waren die anderen und insbesondere Deutschland bereit, einen hohen Kreditbetrag Frankreich zur flankierenden Währungsstützung zu geben.
Es wurde beschlossen, eine neue Kreditlinie oder einen neuen Kreditrahmen der Zentralbanken zugunsten Frankreichs in Höhe von 2 Milliarden Dollar zu eröffnen.
The press said France was committed to devaluing the franc, and the Germans at the conference thought so too. But what happened next led to German accusations of double dealing. Raymond Barre believed the agreement on the loan contained no spelt-out promise to devalue.
Il n'y avait pas de liaison conditionnelle. Il n'était pas indispensable de dévaluer.
The fuse was lit. Enter Cabinet Minister Jean-Marcel Jeanneney in Paris, determined to prevent devaluation.
À ce moment-là, Monsieur Jeannet m'a téléphoné pour me demander mon sentiment. Je le lui ai dit.
Knowing President de Gaulle did not want to devalue, Jeannet set off to see him. As he did so, Barr was seeking confirmation from the chairman of the central bankers who had agreed the loan.
J'ai simplement demandé au gouverneur de la banque belge si, au cas où le gouvernement français ne dévaluait pas, l'aide des banques centrales à la Banque de France pouvait être maintenue. Le gouverneur de la banque belge m'a répondu, mais bien sûr.
When Jeannet went in to see de Gaulle, the French president thought he had no choice but to devalue.
Et c'est pendant que j'étais dans le bureau du général de Gaulle et que je lui disais que selon mes renseignements, aucune obligation de dévaluer n'avait été imposée à Bonn, qu'un huissier est entré dans la pièce, m'a apporté un papier. C'était un papier rédigé par le secrétaire général de l'Élysée à la suite d'un coup de téléphone que Barr lui avait adressé, confirmant qu'il avait réussi à faire sortir le gouverneur de la Banque de Belgique de son bain pour avoir cette confirmation.
Oui, il était dans la salle de bain et j'ai pu néanmoins m'entretenir avec lui.
Le général m'a dit à cette occasion, que voulez-vous? En matière militaire, je connais mes généraux. Dans le domaine des affaires étrangères, je connais bien mes ambassadeurs. En matière économique, je vois que je ne sais pas très bien à qui me fier.
Barr's message convinced de Gaulle that he could get the loan without devaluing. The franc's prestige was more important to him than the understanding reached with Germany. Devaluation, de Gaulle told France, was off the agenda.
Le gouvernement décidait que nous devons achever de nous reprendre sans recourir à la dévaluation.
Wir hielten dies weitgehend für, ohne dass eine formelle Zusage gegeben wurde, doch für einen Vertrauensbruch am Ende der Konferenz.
Any notion that France and Germany could collaborate to produce the euro seemed absurd. De Gaulle was riding roughshod over German feelings. And prosperous Germany would gain nothing by merging the strong Deutschmark with the weak franc. But changes of leader rescued the apparently doomed scheme for monetary union. De Gaulle's successor, Georges Pompidou, abandoned the general's attempt to make France a world power. Instead, Pompidou set out to build a united Europe together with Germany, with EMU as its cement. The pro-European Willy Brandt had become Chancellor of Germany. He offered to put some of Germany's reserves behind the plan. His motive was political. Germany must never again threaten Europe.
Wir haben 2 Weltkriege zu verantworten und es sollte durch die Einigung, durch die Vereinigung in Europa für die Zukunft ausgeschlossen werden, dass unzählige nationale Alleingänge nochmals in Europa stattfinden.
Pompidou's administration also saw EMU as a way of influencing German policy.
Il y avait la crainte un peu diffuse que l'Allemagne soit tentée de développer sa politique extérieure au-delà de l'Europe et qu'elle se tourne notamment vers des projets à l'Est. Alors, les Français craignaient cela pour la construction européenne.
Chancellor Willy Brandt was promoting reconciliation with the Eastern Bloc. He was courting Poland and even the Soviet Union.
Si on engageait un processus de construction économique et monétaire, c'était un bon moyen de, non pas de fixer, mais d'assurer que l'Allemagne participerait à cette construction.
Germany's smaller neighbours had the most to fear if she again ran wild. The man put in charge of planning EMU was the Prime Minister of the smallest, Luxembourg's Pierre Werner.
Le propos de l'unification européenne était précisément de rattacher l'Allemagne à l'Ouest.
The political will to build the single currency was there. Economics was a harder nut to crack. The Germans were reluctant to link their successful economy to the less disciplined French model.
Je crois que les Allemands, et ils nous le disaient gentiment de façon périodique, considéraient que nous n'étions pas très sérieux en matière économique par rapport à eux, et que nous étions un assez mauvais élève. Nous avions des déficits budgétaires, nous avions une inflation dans laquelle nous nous sentions bien.
The French wanted a quick start to EMU. The Germans emphasized the difficulties.
Wir wollten das allmähliche Hinkommen zu einer einheitlichen Währung, begleitet von einem Prozess der sehr kräftigen Harmonisierung der Finanzpolitik.
Je les ai mis en demeure de se mettre d'accord sur une formule et que je ne pouvais pas accepter d'achever le rapport si les deux points de vue n'auraient pas reçu satisfaction.
La turbulence monétaire, on peut la caractériser par un petit dessin. Mettons ici le florin.
The problem the committee had to resolve was the wild fluctuations that were occurring in the currency rates.
Là, le franc belge ici, le franc français là, et le Deutschmark là. C'est une situation de désordre.
The committee's job was to work out how to eliminate the swings.
On pouvait essayer d'imaginer un système dans lequel le florin hollandais...
Central banks undertook to narrow the gaps between the currencies by buying currencies whose rate was falling and selling those that were rising. This would eventually force currencies into a stable pattern.
Ce qui aboutit, si on enveloppe tout ça entre deux lignes, on aboutit à quelque chose qui ressemble étrangement à un serpent. Et c'est pour ça qu'on a appelé ça le serpent.
When the snake, the first step towards EMU, was planned, European public opinion saw the common market as an uninterrupted success story. EMU, too, seemed a surefire winner. This optimism was shared by Edward Heath, who in 1970 applied to bring Britain into the community.
Never before, at least for 1,000 years, has there been a time when the governments and peoples of Western Europe have agreed so fully on so many of the major problems which confront them.
If they wanted to join the snake, Heath's government needed to damp down inflation. To do this, they restricted pay rises. Then over 250,000 miners struck for a massive wage increase. Picketing miners tried to stop fuel deliveries to factories. The dispute seemed to have no connection with the currency scheme. In fact, as was to happen often, Britain's pledges to Europe were to be held hostage by troubles at home.
It's really biting. Another fortnight, country will be standing still.
After 6 days, the miners won. They got a 25% pay increase.
The effect of the miners' strike and of what was clearly a very inflationary settlement was a disaster. We were very upset indeed.
But Heath would not be deflected from his European mission. He had secured France's support for Britain's application to join the common market. Now he also took Britain into Europe's fledgling monetary system, the snake.
Ted Heath, I believe, saw this as a massive advance towards a European Union, and it was a political decision to go into the snake more than an economic decision.
On June the 8th, 1972, 5 weeks after Britain went into the snake, UK balance of payments figures were published. A loss of £272 million showed the effect of the miners and other disputes.
There was a run on the pound, and at the end of June, the position became impossible. The reserves were disappearing hour by hour.
It was something like $2.5 billion had flown out.
It was a catastrophe.
The decision is made to sacrifice the exchange rate.
Less than 2 months after Britain had joined Europe's currency system, the miners' victory had helped force her out. Britain, some Europeans commented, was running true to form.
Les Anglais savent aussi bien sortir, même quand ils ont signé.
The agreement on the currency system had been quite specific.
Ce qui s'est passé sur l'adhésion au serpent. Il l'avait signé. C'est le Treasury qui l'a signé. Alors il n'a pas considéré les événements de façon sérieuse. Vous savez, nous faisons, en Europe continentale, nous faisons les choses sérieusement. Nous n'avons pas besoin du Conseil anglais dans le domaine.
Shrugging off the British departure, the continental countries forged ahead with building EMU.
It was the French who were very much in favor of economic and monetary union.
President Pompidou called a conference in Paris. Like Pompidou and Brandt, the leaders of the Netherlands and Belgium wanted to lock Germany into the community. So did Italy. 3 new member countries were also invited. Edward Heath was given another chance to back EMU.
Et personne ne s'étonnera que j'ai une pensée particulière pour les premiers ministres du Danemark, de l'Irlande et du Royaume-Uni.
Pompidou proposed a great leap forward towards EMU and a single currency for Europe.
The draft communiqué contained the sentence committing the European community to have full economic and monetary union by 1980.
Pierre Werner of Luxembourg spelt out the technique that EMU's backers were to use to inch the project forward over the next 20 years. Deadlines were the key.
L'expérience qui a été faite pendant le développement du marché commun a prouvé que la fixation de dates fixes pour atteindre certains buts est un stimulant extrêmement fort.
The 1980 deadline for EMU was only 8 years away. Shaken by the snake fiasco, some British officials took issue with Heath.
Prime Minister, how's it going? It's going extremely well. We've had a very good morning. There's a lot of agreement.
The snake was rather a good example of why it would be a very, very high-risk thing to do, to aim for a monetary union so soon. It was plain that the currencies were simply not going quickly to become relatively stable towards each other.
Mr. Heath, I think, was clearly determined to go ahead as an act of faith.
Now, at the end of that, around about 10 o'clock at night, one of our members said, well, when are we going to meet again? And Pompidou said, well, it's all got to be completed by 1980, so we better meet in 1980 and celebrate.
All the leaders had at last committed themselves to complete monetary union, and a date.
Who remembers the foolishness of that decision? It was a nonsense, but, you know, so what?
The high-flown political dream did not last. In 1973, war in the Middle East led to the quadrupling of oil prices. France, anxious to control her own economic policy, pulled out of the currency snake. Italy had already gone, and Britain wasn't returning. In 1974, the target date of 1980 for monetary union was abandoned. EMU vanished from the agenda. But the idea would not die. Again, new leaders emerged to champion it. President Giscard d'Estaing of France had linked up with the Chancellor of West Germany.
Helmut Schmidt speaking. Hallo Helmut.
Hallo Valerie.
Wie geht's?
Both had been finance ministers.
Wie steht's mit meiner Reise in der Bundesrepublik?
Oh, die ist in guter Vorbereitung. Ich werde Ihnen morgen berichten, Valerie.
Both wanted to lock Germany to the West.
Look forward to be seeing you tomorrow.
Roy Jenkins had changed jobs. The former British Chancellor was now President of the European Commission. EMU, Jenkins proclaimed in 1977, was the only way to jolt the community out of the recession that followed the oil crisis.
Helmut Schmidt decided this was what he wanted to throw the German weight behind. I shall never forget the meeting which I had with Schmidt in the Bundeschancellery in Bonn, when over about 3 hours he expounded to me his position. I drove back to Brussels, about a 2-hour drive, in a state of high excitement, because we were in serious business.
With Giscard d'Estaing, Schmidt proposed reviving and extending the snake.
Alors ce que nous voulons essayer d'obtenir, c'est qu'en Europe, les monnaies cessent de bouger les unes par rapport aux autres. Et que donc les
Their final goal was a single currency.
Ce sera vraiment la monnaie de l'Europe. Eh bien, cette monnaie de l'Europe sera, au point de vue des transactions commerciales, la première du monde.
The two continental leaders now looked across the Channel.
Ich bin immer der Überzeugung gewesen, dass es dringend wünschenswert war, England dabei zu haben innerhalb der europäischen Integration.
But the new British Chancellor was not convinced by the Franco-German scheme.
The really striking thing was that the people who were very keen on the exchange rate mechanism and the European monetary system, which it was supposed to be part of, were politicians who didn't know very much about economics, like Giscard d'Estaing, the President of France, and Helmut Schmidt.
Giscard d'Estaing und ich waren beide ökonomisch sehr gut ausgebildet. Es ist ein Irrtum zu glauben, wir hätten von der Sache nichts verstanden. Wir haben die Grundregeln des EWS zum Teil im Wohnzimmer von Giscard d'Estaing und zum Teil in meinem Wohnzimmer in Hamburg ausgedacht. Jeder nur mit einem einzigen Berater und nicht mit 1000 Bürokraten aus unseren Finanzministerien oder aus unseren Außenministerien.
Raymond Barre, who had helped devise EMU, was now Prime Minister of France. For him, Germany was the key partner.
Nous savons bien que dans les affaires européennes, c'est le duo qui est important et que le trio ne se constitue qu'après.
Barre had been advised by an old hand on how to deal with London.
Les Anglais arrivent en retard lorsqu'ils se sont assurés que les choses marchent. Je vous ai peut-être raconté ce que M. Jean Monnet m'a dit quand j'ai été nommé à Bruxelles. M. Jean Monnet m'a dit, et alors que je lui rendais visite, c'était en 67, vous aurez beaucoup de difficultés avec les Anglais. Je les connais bien, ce sont de vieux amis. Je vais vous donner un conseil, ne vous intéressez pas à ce qu'ils disent. Faites ce que vous devez faire. Et vous allez voir, si vous réussissez, car il faut que vous réussissiez, ils vous rattraperont au pas de course.
The French were not waiting. President Giscard d'Estaing of France flew to the German border town of Aachen with Chancellor Schmidt.
Die Zukunft Europas ist ohne Frankreich nicht denkbar. Sie ist auch nicht denkbar ohne Deutschland. Sie ist vorstellbar ohne Großbritannien.
Aachen, known to the French as Aix-la-Chapelle, was the hub of Charlemagne's empire, which included France and Germany, but not Britain. There, Giscard and Schmidt agreed a deadline for pushing EMU forward.
Et lorsque nous sommes retrouvés à Aix-la-Chapelle, près du tombeau de Charlemagne, j'ai obtenu l'accord d'Helmut Schmidt pour qu'on passe à la deuxième étape de l'union monétaire qui était prévue pour 82-83 et que l'on mette en place à cette époque la Banque centrale européenne.
Die Franzosen waren überzeugt, dass es notwendig sei, Deutschland einzubinden. Und die deutsche politische Klasse war überzeugt, dass es wünschenswert sei, Deutschland einzubinden.
Primo motivo per cui si popolarizzò l'idea dell'Unione Europea era che era necessario mettere fine ai contrasti tra Francia e Germania, che generazioni mie hanno visto che cosa è successo quando questo non c'è.
The pattern was set for the future. The continental powers would go ahead without Britain.
It may well be the case that our continental colleagues were irritated that we took part in the negotiations when we made it clear we didn't plan to join. But occasionally in the real world, you have to put up with the irritation of colleagues to protect your national interest, and I make no apology for that.
Wenn die Engländer weiterhin draußen bleiben wollten, dann müssen sie sich eines Tages dazu entscheiden, der 51. Staat der Vereinigten Staaten von Amerika zu werden.
After months of delay, and to no one's surprise, Prime Minister James Callaghan announced Britain was staying out. Early in 1979, the rest of the community set off on a road the scheme's two founders hoped would lead to a single currency for Europe. Political will had triumphed over economic objections. The project was to last unchanged for 14 years and dominate continental and British economic planning. Ironically, after announcing that Britain was staying out, Callaghan was challenged in the Commons by the Conservative leader of the opposition. She had a rough ride.
This is a sad day for Europe in that... This is a sad day for Europe in that the 9 member countries have been unable to agree on a major new initiative which will affect us all. Has not the Prime Minister come back from Brussels with the worst of all worlds? No reduction in the budget contribution and no membership of the EMS.
At this stage in her career, Margaret Thatcher was supporting a European monetary system. But not for long.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1. François Mitterrand est élu président de la République.
If one man is responsible for economic and monetary union, it is François Mitterrand, President of France. He began by turning his back on French membership of the existing European monetary system. Currency stability meant nothing to Mitterrand. All he wanted was to bring socialism to France, raising wages and pensions, nationalizing banks and industries, all highly popular. The rest of Europe looked on in amazement and horror. The French franc paid a terrible price. Nobody wanted it. Mitterrand kept the bonanza going through 2 devaluations of the franc in 1 year. In the first months of Mitterrand's presidency, his finance minister, Jacques Delors, kept warning him that he was bankrupting his country.
J'ai accepté d'être le ministre chargé du dirty job. Dès le début, j'avais recommandé la précaution. Mais je n'ai pas été toujours suivi, c'est le moins qu'on puisse dire.
Il avait tendance à modérer notre allure. Moi, j'avais tendance à l'accélérer. Mais c'était moi le président de la République.
The Republic was going bust. In March 1983, 18 months into Mitterrand's presidency, he had to pay for the party.
Monsieur le Président de la République.
A decision became unavoidable: to abandon socialism and stay in the European monetary system, the currency stability mechanism his predecessor had founded, or pursue socialism and leave the EMS.
Et le lundi matin, il demande de venir le voir. Je n'avais pas l'habitude de le voir le lundi matin. Il me pose un peu brutalement une question. Voilà, je vous demande de sortir du système monétaire européen. Et je lui réponds non, aussi brutalement.
Le Premier ministre estimait que si je décidais de quitter le SME, il ne pourrait pas rester à la tête du gouvernement.
Je peux vous dire que je sais conduire une voiture, mais je ne sais pas la conduire sur le verglas. Alors je descends de la voiture. Ah, je vous la laisse.
Mitterrand gave in to his prime minister. At last, he had accepted that France must stay in the EMS.
Mais l'appréciation était difficile. Elle m'a valu des réflexions très dures. Et je savais bien que de cette décision, beaucoup de choses découleraient. Enfin, je l'ai prise.
France now had to beg Germany to rescue it. To this end, Mitterrand set about deceiving his own finance minister, Jacques Delors. Not for nothing was Mitterrand known as the Fox.
François Mitterrand a volontairement caché la vérité à Jacques Delors. Il ne lui a pas dit qu'il avait décidé de rester dans le système monétaire européen pour que Jacques Delors, en toute sincérité, puisse dire aux Allemands « Eh bien, si vous n'acceptez pas une parité franc-marque correcte, nous allons sortir du système monétaire européen. »
Delors was a keen supporter of the European community and of France remaining a member of the EMS. Mitterrand exploited his finance minister's Euro commitment.
Le message était: puisque vous voulez absolument que le franc français reste dans le système monétaire européen, tentez votre chance. Et c'est dans cet état d'esprit que je suis parti à Bruxelles.
As he arrived in Brussels, Delors adopted the unusual tactic of insulting the people from whom he was seeking salvation, the Germans.
Si rien n'évolue, la France quittera le système monétaire européen à la fin de cette réunion. Devant des gens arrogants et incompréhensibles, que voulez-vous que je fasse?
He blamed me and blamed the Bundesbank for being too stubborn and too arrogant, as he called it.
Je n'aime pas beaucoup me transformer en metteur en scène, mais c'est parfois nécessaire, dans la politique comme d'ailleurs dans d'autres domaines. Et par conséquent, puisque les Allemands n'avaient pas compris ou ne voulaient pas comprendre la gravité du message que je leur avais transmis, il fallait que je force le ton.
And what they particularly had in mind was that we should support the French franc.
Si vous n'acceptez pas de faire un effort, c'est-à-dire de réévaluer le Deutschmark, alors moi je serai obligé d'abandonner la partie et le franc français sortira du système monétaire européen.
When the Germans refused to help, Delors left for Paris.
In der Nacht vom Sonntag auf Montag war es wohl jetzt eigentlich am Ende unserer Möglichkeiten standen, dass wir uns jetzt in den nächsten 2 Stunden einigen oder wir eben uns nicht einigen.
When no agreement was reached, the inconceivable happened.
The money markets of Europe were obliged to stay closed, the dealing rooms empty because there was no official rate for the dealers to work with. Someone had to give way.
Immer in einer dramatischen Situation war dies natürlich eine Entscheidung, die der Finanzminister dann in diesem Augenblick nicht allein trug, wo er dann nochmal den Bundeskanzler anrief.
No German chancellor could risk being blamed both for abandoning France and destroying the European monetary system. Helmut Kohl told his finance minister to give in.
Ça va maintenant. Bien. Meine Damen und Herren, ich darf diese Pressekonferenz eröffnen.
Die deutsche Mark wird aufgewertet um 5,5%, der holländische Gulden um 3,5%.
That afternoon, when the EC heads of government joined their finance ministers in Brussels, Chancellor Kohl took satisfaction in his new role as Europe's strongman and saviour. But Mitterrand did not like France being at Germany's mercy.
Die sagten, wir haben im Prinzip eine europäische Währung, das ist die D-Mark. Aber wir können als Franzosen nicht die D-Mark als europäische Währung akzeptieren. Und deshalb muss unser Ziel sein, eine gemeinsame neue Währung zu schaffen.
Mitterrand now completed his U-turn. With the fanaticism of the convert and without consulting his countrymen, he committed himself and the state of France to achieving economic and monetary union, EMU. Mitterrand began by having his finance minister placed in the key role of President of the European Commission. Delors' first task there was to rewrite the rules of the European Community. He seized his chance to advance the monetary cause.
Et j'ai proposé d'intégrer la capacité monétaire au ministre des Finances.
Delors' proposal upset the German financial community. For them, the Deutschmark was supreme and must not be tampered with by Brussels.
Außerdem haben wir in der Sache dagegen, nicht? Wir sahen überhaupt nicht die Voraussetzungen jetzt für eine Währungsunion als gegeben an.
C'est qu'il a commencé par dire no way, rien à voir avec les affaires monétaires, la communauté économique européenne, le traité de Rome, tout ça, ça n'a rien à voir avec les affaires monétaires. On ne voit pas pourquoi maintenant on mettrait tout ça dans le même bateau.
Wir befürchteten, wenn in die einheitliche europäische Akteschaffung des Binnenmarktes ein Kapitel, harmloses Kapitel, die Weiterentwicklung zur Währungsunion reinkommen würde, dass sich dadurch ein trojanisches Pferd dort nett anzusehen, aber plötzlich springen Soldaten heraus und bedrohen uns, ihr habt dies und jenes zu tun.
Et à ce moment-là, il y a eu beaucoup de réticence, beaucoup d'opposition. On me reprochait d'aller trop vite.
There were many opponents to Delors' plan to write the principle of monetary union into the single act, which would now govern the European community. German bankers thought they were the strongest, but they hadn't met Mrs. Margaret Thatcher. Chancellor Kohl did.
Mrs. Thatcher was entirely opposed to having any monetary ingredient in the Single European Act. She was against it, the Chancellor of the Exchequer was against it, and she hoped that Chancellor Kohl of Germany would support her in opposition to it.
It was quite clear that the Germans, as personified by Helmut Kohl, but buttressed by the Federal Reserve Central Bank Governor, Carlotta Pohl, were not in favour of such a change. We went to Luxembourg believing, therefore, that we had a reasonably firm alliance to exclude this.
Mrs. Thatcher arrived confident. But she didn't know that Delors had already bought off the opposition of Kohl's financial advisors.
Donc pour calmer les craintes des Allemands, j'ai ajouté un texte qui disait si un jour on va plus loin, alors il faudra l'accord des gouvernements et une nouvelle conférence intergouvernementale et un nouveau traité. Moyennant cette garantie qu'il n'y aurait pas une sorte de progression behind the door, derrière la porte, implicite, les Allemands ont accepté mon texte.
Now that Mitterrand had Delors in the Commission doing the dirty jobs needed to win over EMU's opponents, he set about enlisting his second key ally, Chancellor Helmut Kohl. In Luxembourg, they had breakfast together.
Le président a expliqué au chancelier, il nous faut une monnaie unique, c'est la seule façon de maintenir la construction européenne.
Zwischen Deutschland und Frankreich seit dem 16. Jahrhundert 27 große Kriege geführt waren. Und die Erkenntnis doch die war, dass Friede in Europa voraussetzt, dass es zwischen Frankreich und Deutschland zu einer engen Freundschaft und Zusammenarbeit kommt.
A problem one always encounters when one looks to the Germans for reliable support is that they are very vulnerable to pressure from France. It's rather like the relationship between a stoat and a rabbit. The French have the ability to transfix the Germans, to petrify them, and to get their way over the Germans or make them come to heel.
Kohl bought the package Mitterrand was peddling, including all the latest Delors improvements. Both knew that they had to sell it to Mrs. Thatcher, and that Kohl was the man to do it.
There were quite a few discussions in the margins of the Luxembourg European Council as to how to hammer out some sort of compromise on economic and monetary union. The principal one was a rather agitated discussion in the corridors of the Council between, as I recall, Margaret Thatcher, Geoffrey Howe, Chancellor Kohl and myself.
Bat mich dann dazu zu kommen und doch mit Mrs. Thatcher einmal darüber zu sprechen, was denn eigentlich die Ratio hinter diesem Vorschlag war. Und ich habe versucht, ihr das deutlich zu machen. Und sie waren natürlich nicht begeistert. Am liebsten hätte sie gar nichts erwähnt.
As far as the Single European Act was concerned, we were uniquely and powerfully interested in changes that would enable us to make headway with the single market. And if we were to get the changes we wanted on that, then we had to be prepared to make some other concessions.
Mrs. Thatcher's Foreign Secretary and Chancellor were pulling her in opposite directions.
She was persuaded by the Foreign Office, oh, well, this doesn't mean anything. A preamble is just a preamble, and a heading is just a heading. There's no text. Nothing will happen. It's just words, usual Euro waffle, Euro babble.
And frankly, the inclusion of a referential clause about economic and monetary union was a very modest price indeed. It cost us nothing.
And the reference which did remain was a very serious one. It was not merely in the preamble, but also the words occurred, the dreaded words, economic and monetary union occurred at the heading of one of the chapters of the treaty.
It was a marathon, and it's the longest one we've had. I don't think we needed to go in for it, but they wanted to do it this way, and so it obviously played. It was best to go along with them.
So, with a reluctant Mrs. Thatcher on board, the Single European Act was all set to roll, complete with its new coach, the EMU clause.
François Mitterrand aimait bien prendre cette comparaison, qui était une comparaison ferroviaire. Il disait, l'Europe c'est un petit peu comme un train. Et ce train européen doit partir à 2 heures. Les différents partenaires européens sont d'accord, nous allons partir à 2 heures. Madame Thatcher dit, non, pas question. Le train ne partira pas à 2 heures, d'ailleurs le train ne partira pas. Si le train va partir. Non, le train ne partira pas. Non, jamais, le train ne partira pas, je refuse, le train va rester en gare. 2h moins 3, 2h moins 2, 2h moins 1. Et à 2h moins 1 seconde, pouch, effectivement, le train européen partait avec la Grande-Bretagne dans le dernier wagon.
Getting everyone on board the train had required great ingenuity. To get them to the destination of economic and monetary union would need political genius. The first step would be a committee.
Quand on m'a demandé mon avis sur quel genre de comité, je leur ai dit, ce comité ne peut réussir que si les gouverneurs de banque centrale en sont membres. Que le plus grand obstacle à la réalisation de l'union économique et monétaire, le plus grand scepticisme, était chez les gouverneurs de banque centrale, et en même temps la plus grande compétence.
Delors' suggestion of a bankers' committee found favour with the German Chancellor, and Kohl knew that Mitterrand wanted Jacques Delors as its chairman. He waited until his next private meeting with Mitterrand, who had no idea what Kohl had in mind.
Et Helmut Kohl a précisé à François Mitterrand qu'il allait demander à Jacques Delors, faire adopter par le sommet une proposition sur laquelle Jacques Delors préside un comité chargé de définir les conditions dans lesquelles on pouvait faire l'union économique et monétaire.
Since this was exactly what Mitterrand wanted, Kohl could name his price. France must drop controls on free capital movement in Europe. For 3 years, Mitterrand had been resisting this proposal.
Es konnte nur noch Präsident Mitterrand diese Frage abschließend beantworten. Und zu unserer Überraschung, ich selbst konnte an diesem Gespräch teilnehmen, hat Präsident Mitterrand, als ihn Bundeskanzler Kohl darauf ansprach, eigentlich ziemlich selbstverständlich und für mich sehr natürlich reagiert, indem er sagte, wenn wir die Währungsunion wollen, dann kann es auch keine Kapitalverkehrskontrollen mehr geben. Und damit war das Thema innerhalb einer Minute erledigt.
In this cavalier way, Mitterrand sacrificed the French financial services industry to advance EMU.
Nous attendons des pommes pour leur donner à manger.
Soon afterwards, Kohl invited Delors to his home.
Moi, il y avait simplement mon directeur de cabinet de mon côté. Et lui, si je me souviens bien, était seul. Et j'ai d'abord parlé en tête-à-tête avec lui. Et nous avons envisagé cette question dès le matin. Puis ensuite, il nous a emmenés déjeuner dans un de ses restaurants favoris, où on lui sert aussi les plats qu'il aime.
On a mangé du Saumager, exercice dans lequel le Kohl est incontestablement imbattable, en tout cas par les quantités.
Kohl told Delors he and Mitterrand wanted him to chair the committee. Delors knew that the governors of all the state banks on the committee would be against him, but he had an ego equal to Kohl's appetite.
Ce n'est pas moi qui lui ai proposé de présider le comité. Vous savez ce que l'on dit dans l'Évangile. Il faut s'asseoir au bout de la table et attendre qu'on vous appelle. Bon. Donc, ce n'est pas moi qui lui ai proposé.
At the next EC summit, Kohl was presiding. He had talked Mrs. Thatcher into accepting the EMU clause in the Single European Act. Now he tried to sell her the idea of the EMU committee.
Chancellor Kohl took Mrs. Thatcher to one side in the council room and said to her, "Look, Margaret, there's nothing much to worry about here. We're going to have some experts. They'll talk about economic and monetary union. You know what experts are like. They never get anything done. It'll take a long time for anything to emerge from this."
Then at dinner, Kohl sprang on his fellow heads of government the name of the committee's chairman, Jacques Delors, the president of the European Commission.
Wenn der Bundeskanzler einen solchen Vorschlag machte, war jedem am Tisch klar, dass das mit Präsident Mitterrand abgestimmt war. Und in einem solchen Augenblick war es eigentlich nicht üblich, dass jemand noch öffentlich Einspruch erhob.
If Mrs. Thatcher got up and tried to veto the appointment of the President of the Commission to chair a committee within the European community, she would look a bit of an ass, frankly. People would say, but he's President of the Commission. You even voted, you even nominated him for that job, and now you're trying to veto him. What are you doing? Some things you can't achieve.
At the all-powerful German Bundesbank, the president had been expecting to get the chairmanship himself.
I learned, actually, early in the morning, 7:30 or so, my Belgian colleague, Jean Godot, called me. He said, "Are you aware that we should form a committee chaired by Delors and attended by some people who the heads of state in their wisdom had chosen as experts?"
On dit, mais ça ne va pas, c'est pas ça qu'on va. Moi, j'aurais beaucoup de peine à participer à un comité dans de telles conditions, présidé par un homme politique au lieu d'être présidé par un expert ou un homme de banque centrale.
Yeah, that was one of the darkest moments in my time as president of the Bundesbank, I have to tell you. And I was deeply disappointed, to say the least, what had happened.
Ich habe mit Herrn Pöhl darüber geredet. Ich erinnere, dass er auch über diese Veränderung der Leitungsfunktion von Jacques Delors überrascht war. Aber es war ja auch klar, dass keiner der Notenbankpräsidenten eine Einladung oder Aufforderung der Staats- und Regierungschefs in dieser Gruppe mitzuwirken ablehnen kann.
Despite the blessing of Kohl and Mitterrand, Delors faced formidable opposition, especially from Bundesbank President Karl Otto Perl. If any blueprint for monetary union were implemented, it would kill the Bundesbank and the Deutschmark, and Pearl was responsible for the health of both.
Man kann nur wünschen, dass auch in der Zukunft wir in der Lage sein werden, eine Politik zu betreiben, die die D-Mark hart erhält im Interesse unserer Bevölkerung, aber auch als Beitrag für eine stabile wirtschaftliche Entwicklung in Europa.
Le Deutschmark, c'est le symbole de la reconstruction allemande. C'est en plus le symbole de la confiance des Allemands dans leur économie. C'est un drapeau. Un drapeau. Donc nous avons eu toujours cette conscience aiguë, si vous voulez, du sacrifice qu'on demande aux Allemands.
Mrs. Thatcher was sure she could put a stop to all this EMU nonsense. She told Britain's representative on the committee what she expected of him.
Before the Law Committee met for the first time, I had a meeting with Mrs. Thatcher, Geoffrey Howe and Nigel Lawson to talk about what our fundamental approach both to the work of the committee and to the idea of EMU was to be.
And we discussed the tactics, and the tactics we felt had to be to try and forge an alliance between Karl Otto Perl, the chairman of the German Bundesbank, and Robin Lee Pemberton.
Well, Karl Otto Perl is someone with whom Margaret Thatcher and I and Nigel had collective discussions, private discussions, and he clearly left us with the impression that he was not himself in favour of moving to a single currency. So he was, in effect, our anchor man.
The lines were drawn for a battle royal. Committee Chairman Delors, with his career and the whole future of EMU at stake if he failed, against the weight of Karl Otto Perl, president of the world's most successful central bank. To win, Delors would need the skills of a magician. His first trick was suggesting the venue for their meetings.
C'est lui qui a dit tout à fait spontanément, habilement d'ailleurs, il a dit mais puisque nous devons nous rencontrer et que vous vous rencontrez à Bâle, pourquoi n'ajoutons-nous pas quelques heures aux réunions que vous tenez ici à Bâle? Et donc je vous propose, si la BRI veut bien nous accueillir, que nous tenions nos réunions ici à la BRI.
Certamente Delors affrontò questa presidenza giocando in trasferta, perché presiedeva i governatori, le riunioni si tenevano a Basilea, che era la tana dei governatori.
The questions Delors put before the committee were carefully chosen. First, were they satisfied the existing currency arrangement worked? And second, could they devise a structure that might work better?
Bref, nous n'avons pas à discuter pour savoir si c'est bon ou si c'est mauvais, s'il faut le faire ou s'il ne faut pas le faire. C'est pas ça qu'on nous a demandé. On nous a demandé de répondre aux questions que je viens de vous dire. Et je vous prie instamment de vous en tenir à ça.
You know, Delors was very biased. He thought he had the support and the backing of all the heads of state and government to get forward, and he just needed the approval of this little technicians. You know, in the French view, you know, the central bankers were not really highly regarded.
Si certains d'entre vous sont contre ce projet, et je sais qu'il y en a, en parlez-en avec votre gouvernement.
Delors' next tactic was language. At the beginning, he spoke in French, with simultaneous translation. Karl Otto Perl showed his irritation by removing his headphones.
Mais je me suis perçu à un moment que quand il s'agissait d'aboutir à des compromis, à des accords, l'interprétation fatiguait les collègues qui ne parlaient pas français. Et donc j'ai décidé de parler anglais, ce qui a beaucoup facilité la réalisation des compromis, puis ensuite la lecture ligne après ligne du rapport, les amendements et autres.
Delors' English at that time was very limited. He had actually difficulties to lead the committee in English, but that was one of his very generous gestures that he said, nevertheless, we will have it in English if the governors had no problem.
When Delors put his draft report on EMU before the committee, the long-expected confrontation came.
dès le début de la séance, on a dit mais c'est pas ça, surtout Carlo Topel. C'est pas ce document, ça ne nous convient pas, c'est pas le rapport qu'il fallait. Je ne reconnais pas un certain nombre des idées que nous avons maniées.
Delors, he is very smart, you know. He understood that a report without the signature of the president of the Bundesbank was practically worthless. And so he gave in. He gave in.
Il fallait donc, bien entendu, que j'ai la signature de Carlo Topel.
To get Pearl's signature, Delors had to accept the main German demand. The proposed European Central Bank would not be under the control of elected politicians. It would be independent. Before agreeing this, Delors checked with Mitterrand. What Pearl had in mind was not very French.
We would say it should be a system very similar to the Bundesbank system, which has proven its merits and its efficiency in the past. So that, in a nutshell, is what we said.
He believed, I think quite rightly, that the Bundesbank represented as good a model of a central bank as the world has known. And if the European Economic and Monetary Union was to be a success, it needed a central bank on those lines.
In the midst of the committee work, Mrs. Thatcher visited Karl Otto Pearl in Frankfurt. She still believed that the Bundesbank president would do Britain's dirty work and prevent progress towards EMU.
Mrs. Thatcher gave them a lecture on the evils of economic and monetary union, on the lack of need for such a concept.
She started a long monologue and explained to all of us that this was complete nonsense.
Mrs. Thatcher put on one of her pyrotechnic performances on European issues, which left a number of very senior German bankers stunned into silence.
I will never go to the Queen and present her European banknotes which do not include her picture. I said, well, that we can solve this problem, we can put picture of the Queen of England on the backside of the Euro notes.
Even at the end of her visit, Mrs. Thatcher still did not realize that Delors and Pearl were now marching to the same tune.
When I recognized that most of my requests were accepted, and the most important part was the part on the role of the European Central Bank. That was and that's in the report, very clearly written, simple but important. Then I said, well, I can live with that.
Pour Carlo Topel, je l'ai compris 2 réunions avant la fin. Pauline Pemberton, si nous étions vus à l'époque, je n'aurais pu faire aucun pronostic.
Only one governor of a state bank need vote against the scheme, and it would be dead in the water. Mrs. Thatcher's man on the committee knew his duty.
I hadn't made up my mind. I was content to let the thing, let the meeting, the committee, the work jog on, and perhaps I was only postponing the evil day. But that's indeed what I did, and the decision by me to sign followed Karl Otto's decision to sign.
Je faisais la queue derrière lui pour signer le rapport final, et en sortant son porte-plume réservoir, Robin m'avait dit « I wonder if I'm not signing my death warrant ».
Quand on a terminé un travail dans un groupe, même si on ne s'aime pas beaucoup, il y a social aspect, quoi. L'aspect social. Ils étaient même un peu surpris d'avoir réussi ensemble à le faire.
We all had a glass of champagne and toasted, I don't know whether it was the report or ourselves, but it was an agreeable little moment at the end of, 7 or 8 months' work.
Robin Lee Pemberton wrote a letter to Mrs. Thatcher explaining why he had signed the Delors report. She never replied.
Le fait que ce rapport ait été accepté à l'unanimité a renforcé sa crédibilité technique aux yeux des experts internationaux, des marchés financiers et autres.
The central bank governors, steered by Delors, had unanimously agreed on how it could be done. Now it was for the heads of government to decide whether to do it, and if so, when. But Helmut Kohl had other things on his mind. The Berlin Wall came down. Suddenly, the map of Europe was redrawn. Less than 3 weeks later, Chancellor Kohl surprised the world by calling for the reunification of East and West Germany.
Wie ein wiedervereinigtes Deutschland schließlich aussehen wird, das weiß heute niemand. Dass aber die Einheit kommen wird, wenn die Menschen in Deutschland sie wollen, dessen bin ich sicher.
Reunified, Germany would be by far the largest country in Europe and might look east as much as west. President Mitterrand recognized both a danger and an opportunity.
C'est un patriote allemand, c'était normal qu'il puisse désirer l'unité allemande. Mais on le sentait prêt à certaines concessions pour y parvenir.
Et c'est grâce aux réticences françaises à l'égard d'une réunification inconditionnelle que nous avons la monnaie unique. Qu'on aime ou pas la monnaie unique ne serait pas, n'aurait pas été créée sans les réticences de François Mitterrand à la réunification allemande.
Mitterrand demanded one main concession before he would support the reunification of Germany: agreement on a start date for implementing the EMU clause in the Single European Act.
Die Franzosen fragten, warum wir zögern in der Frage der Festlegung. Und ich glaube, dass die Franzosen dachten, aha, die Deutschen sehen ihre Einheit greifbar nahe und sobald sie vereinigt sind, werden sie vielleicht solche Fragen überhaupt mal völlig neu sehen. Nicht?
Genscher est venu pour nous rassurer, disant mais la politique allemande ne changera pas, c'est bien celle-ci, nous allons vers l'intégration européenne, l'Allemagne et la France doivent montrer l'exemple, nous voulons aller vers une union monétaire, et donc il était plutôt rassurant. Et il viendra le dire à Mitterrand. Il va me demander d'organiser un rendez-vous soir, je me rappelle assez tard, avec François Mitterrand.
The French president was determined to bounce the Germans into making a firm commitment to EMU at once. Only 2 days after Kohl's reunification speech, the German foreign minister faced a purposeful Mitterrand.
Il a même été assez brutal. Il a dit c'est pas la peine de m'envoyer toutes sortes d'émissaires. Je vous confirme que je vais demander à Strasbourg la fixation d'une date. Et que rien ne me fera changer d'avis. Et que donc, s'il doit y avoir un désaccord entre nos deux pays, il y aura un désaccord. Voilà.
C'était pas une menace, mais enfin, c'était quand même une mise à plat des choses entre amis.
Ich habe ihm gesagt, das werden Sie nicht tun müssen. Das Vereinigte Deutschland wird den europäischen Kurs weitergehen.
Il a dit ce qu'il avait à dire, et puis il a enregistré ce qu'avait dit le président, et il a dit je ferai part au chancelier, naturellement.
Ich habe mit dem Bundeskanzler nach der Rückkehr aus Paris darüber gesprochen und wir haben dann sehr schnell unser Einverständnis damit erklärt, dass man schon in Straßburg sagt, Ende 1990 wird eine solche Regierungskonferenz stattfinden.
Et la réalité, c'est que l'unité allemande était voulue par les Allemands et qu'on ne pouvait absolument pas s'opposer à la volonté populaire allemande. Il fallait simplement la négocier pour la réaliser dans les meilleures conditions possibles pour tout le monde.
3 days later, Kohl told Mitterrand that he was prepared to fix a date. So, only a month after the fall of the wall, Mitterrand was able to announce that the next step to full monetary union would take place within a year.
Conférence intergouvernementale se tiendrait à la diligence du gouvernement italien, président à l'époque, avant la fin 1990.
Mitterrand now put his project into the hands of the Italians, who organized a summit entirely on EMU.
L'esperienza che avevamo fatto che i consigli europei, se si occupano di troppe cose, finiscono con essere molto superficiali.
Before all European summits, draft conclusions are circulated. Umberto Vettani, diplomatic advisor to Andreotti, set out to prove the superiority of Italian diplomacy. He introduced a new method of negotiating the conclusions. He visited all the capitals, kept his draft in his laptop computer, read it to all the parties, but refused ever to print it.
Il motivo era che così facendo mantenevamo una certa flessibilità. Nessuno avrebbe potuto inchiodarci su una frase o su un'espressione particolare.
Les Italiens sont des redoutables négociateurs et, à la différence de négociateurs plus nordiques, ils ont leur méthode.
Those countries in favor of EMU raised no objection to this modern method. The British hated it and refused to discuss the Italians' laptop text. When the European leaders met in Rome, the British delegation felt ambushed.
The first Rome summit was, I think, the most disagreeable summit meeting that I did attend, and that's saying a good deal, because they were not, on the whole, happy occasions in my memory.
Andreotti era al centro di questo tavolo, sulla destra, al quarto o quinto posto, era seduta la signora Thatcher, per cui fu la quarta o quinta a prendere la parola. Tutti dissero che condividevano l'importanza dell'Unione Economica e Monetaria.
Mrs. Thatcher said it was too early to take any steps towards monetary union. When Andreotti summed up, he ignored her. He said the European community would move to the next stage of EMU.
Nessuno ebbe nulla a ridire, tranne la signora Thatcher, che capì perfettamente cosa quelle tre frasette volevano rappresentare. Per cui disse a Andreotti: Presidente, io non mi riconosco nelle sue conclusioni. E Andreotti rispose: lo so bene, signora, ma io ho riassunto le posizioni degli altri.
The heads of government retired to bed, and a group of advisers assembled to check that the final conclusions on EMU, agreed in advance, could be approved by their masters the next day. Now, at last, Vettani distributed a printed version of his draft. It was the last chance for the British to fight back.
Le texte auquel nous étions arrivés, sur un certain nombre de points, était probablement difficile à digérer par les Britanniques. Et nous étions d'ailleurs d'accord là-dessus. Donc dans ces cas-là, la moindre des précautions, quand on travaille professionnellement, ça consiste à donner un signal à la délégation qui peut avoir le plus de problèmes avec cette partie du communiqué, en lui disant « Regardez si ça vous va, faites-nous vos observations ».
The British Treasury official who was working with Mrs. Thatcher on EMU, Nigel Wicks, had left the conference earlier.
Io sapevo invece che dormiva al Grand Hotel. E allora erano probabilmente l'1:30, 1:45 del mattino. Chiamai il numero e chiesi di Nigel Wicks. E dopo un po' mi rispose una voce assonnata, era evidente che stava dormendo già. Perché non vieni? Gli dissi io, così vediamo insieme il testo se c'è qualche cosa che possiamo fare. A quest'ora, mi fece Nigel, dice no, guarda, voi fate il vostro testo, lo vedrò domani mattina presto.
So it was only early the next morning that the British saw the text that they were due to approve in just a few hours.
There's a ritual at European summits. You go to bed after quite a good dinner, but you know that with the milk, as it were, is going to come thudding on your doorstep the presidential conclusion.
We were absolutely convinced, having seen the Italian conclusions, that there was nothing to be gained from trying to amend them. They were beyond amending. There had to be a separate statement of the British view.
The British delegation insisted their statement of dissent be added to the conclusions.
era abbastanza chiaro da come aveva parlato anche il giorno precedente e a cena poi la signora Thatcher, non è che fummo sorpresi di questo.
Fu a quel punto che Andreotti, dopo aver preso atto di questa evoluzione, mi disse ma lei non mi aveva detto che c'era un aggettivo che era stato usato nel testo proprio per venire incontro alla delegazione britannica? Se la delegazione britannica non accetta il testo, che motivo c'è di mantenere quella parola lì?
Now came the final turn of the screw. The key words inserted by Vatani to keep the British on board were a common currency, defining a European currency that could exist alongside sterling, Deutschmarks, francs, lire and so on. The other option, a single currency, would go much further and abolish all the national currencies.
Cosa avrebbe messo, chiese Andreotti, se non fosse stato necessario ottenere l'assenso inglese? Beh, dissi, noi avremmo messo una moneta unica.
La verità è che altra cosa poi è le Q forte e altra cosa è la moneta unica. Questo uno può usare poi tutte le aggettivazioni edulcoranti, ma sono due posizioni che non ci sono.
E va bene al cancelliere moneta unica? Chiese Andreotti. Penso di sì. E allora mi organizzi un incontro col cancelliere. E questo incontro ebbe luogo, fu molto breve. Andreotti lo mise al corrente di quello che era avvenuto, della richiesta britannica di inserire soltanto un testo nelle conclusioni, e aggiunse: non credi, Helmut, che possiamo allora rimettere moneta unica anziché la propria moneta? E Kohl disse di sì.
A brief chat outside the summit had given birth to the euro. When the morning session opened, Andreotti presented the participants with the amended text, establishing a single currency.
Un primo tentativo della signora Thatcher di discutere questo testo fu bloccato dal Presidente del Consiglio italiano, che disse: signora Thatcher, poi c'è il testo suo, qui stiamo discutendo il testo nostro. E quindi da questa discussione fu completamente escluso il Regno Unito, e questo naturalmente facilitò enormemente le cose.
Ricordo che Padoa-Schioppa disse, non riuscendo a trattenere la sua soddisfazione, dice: credo che abbiamo fatto passare l'elefante attraverso il buco della serratura.
It was certainly opportunism for the sudden attack, seizing an advantage, seizing the fact that people were rather fed up with us, that the general mood was tetchy, it was going to be possible to put us in a corner and push, and Andreotti in the chair decided that was exactly what he would do.
I think at that moment, I would have said to America, don't exaggerate it, your concerns about Europe. It's better to be in, and you have still options to influence the process, and this is still a possibility.
I would not accept to have the community saying we must abolish the pound sterling. We will not have that imposed upon us.
Mrs. Thatcher's refusal to compromise had enabled Andreotti to push EMU forward faster than anyone thought possible.
No, no, no.
Mrs. Thatcher had staked her career on holding back European integration. Over 12 years in power, she had been EMU's most implacable foe.
Perhaps the Labour Party would give all those things up.
Yet 3 times she had been outmaneuvered. Now her loathing for EMU played a big part in bringing her down.
After Thatcher, England was considered on the continent as less relevant. They really thought, now we got rid of England, we go on. We have our union, we have an enlarged Germany, we have the Paris-Bonn axis, we can do without Britain.
EMU was, above all, the product of one man's determination. Yet Francois Mitterrand had taken it up only when he had looked into the abyss and seen EMU as France's only hope. With the support of his henchmen, Kohl, Delors and Andreotti, Mitterrand had placed EMU firmly at the centre of the European scene. Less than 2 weeks before European community leaders were scheduled to meet at Maastricht, Chancellor Kohl received an early morning visitor. The Dutch held the European presidency in late 1991, so Prime Minister Ruud Lubbers would preside over this crucial summit.
We were sitting there at the breakfast meeting, and we prepared the whole, of course, of the meeting in Maastricht, but he concentrated on one phrase. I'm not going to sign the Maastricht Treaty if it doesn't contain the irreversibility of the single currency.
Erstens einen erfolgreichen Abschluss von Maastricht wollen. Zweitens, dass wir einen Vertrag wollen, der deutlich macht, dass die Wirtschafts- und Währungsunion, politische Union irreversibel ist. Ich unterstreiche noch einmal dieses Wort, das ist ein entscheidendes Wort.
On the same day that Kohl was lobbying for irreversibility, François Mitterrand and the French cabinet were going one step further.
Quand le président a fait un tour de table en disant bon, alors maintenant nous sommes au bout de la négociation, que faut-il faire pour rendre le passage à la monnaie unique irréversible pour cette sûr. À ce moment-là, c'est vrai que moi j'ai dit il n'y a qu'une seule façon de faire, et j'ai dit en tant que ministre des Affaires européennes, c'est de fixer une date, et une date butoir irrévocable, c'est la seule façon de faire. En même temps, jamais dans la négociation jusqu'ici, entre les ministres des Finances, cette question n'avait été abordée.
Germany's finance minister had doubts about fixing a starting date for the single currency, the third stage of EMU. Theo Weigel was under pressure from a public anxious about losing its beloved Deutschmark, and from Germany's powerful independent central bank, the Bundesbank.
Bundesbank had made it clear that fixing a date for entry into the third stage should not be allowed to prejudice the question of what conditions need to be fulfilled for entering. In other words, the conditions were more important, meeting the conditions was more important than meeting the date.
Ein Zwangsdatum kann hinderlich sein. Wir waren der Meinung, es wäre uns lieber, wenn kein Datum drin stünde.
Mitterrand plunged ahead regardless. He wanted a date agreed. So he came to Maastricht early, breaking his rule of never arriving anywhere till everyone else was waiting for him. He knew that Giulio Andreotti, the Italian Prime Minister, shared his view. They agreed to meet the evening before the summit, in the villa where Mitterrand was staying.
E quando la sera si andò a questo pranzo con il presidente Mitterrand ed era stata preparata, ce ne accorgemmo dal menù, dei piatti che piacevano molto al presidente Mitterrand, che era il ghiotto di ostriche.
Che si è mangiato le ostriche veramente non me lo ricordo, anche perché la sera cerco di mangiare pochissimo, se no dormo male.
Andreotti gli disse, ma non sarebbe meglio mettere una data e decidere che in ogni caso a partire di un certo momento chi c'è e si parte? E non so se distrattamente o meno, ma Mitterrand disse sì, ma perché no, mettiamola.
E fissammo il 99 anche per una ragione, perché se diciamo 2000, cioè se facciamo in modo del 2000, sarebbe fatta forse della facile ironia di un rinvio che sarebbe sembrato più lungo, al terzo millennio. Si arrivò a quella decisione anche un po', direi, psicologicamente. Questo non figurerà in nessuna carta, però di fatto è un po' così.
Je crois que le président Mitterrand, justement, à travers tous les contacts qu'il a eus à Maastricht, toutes les discussions qu'il a eues avec les uns, avec les autres, sa pensée là-dessus s'est décantée. Et quand il a entendu la proposition italienne, 1er janvier 1999, il a dit c'est ça qu'il faut faire. C'est ça.
In front of the heads of government on the first day of the summit was a long draft treaty setting out the requirements for a single currency, but it contained no starting date. With his supporters now in place, Mitterrand moved to fill this gap.
À un moment donné, je sais que c'est le président Mitterrand qui a choisi de mettre ça sur la table à la surprise générale, que le chancelier a dit oui, et que ça a été une surprise générale dans l'ensemble de la négociation.
I got an idea that in fact Andriotti Mitterrand either concluded this or were sort of invited by Kohl that it would come from them so he could say yes and that he was not obliged to go first to the Bundesbank and to the finance ministry and so in Germany itself.
Chancellor Kohl needed to get round his finance minister's skepticism about setting the date.
Ich kann mich noch gut daran erinnern, wie Bundeskanzler Helmut Kohl und Außenminister Hans-Dietrich Genscher und ich uns unterhielten.
Le chancelier a expliqué une fois au président Mitterrand, il a dit, moi, je ne suis pas comme le Premier ministre français, je n'ai pas vraiment le pouvoir de trancher, je dois laisser faire mon gouvernement, mes ministres, mais quand je suis en situation de responsabilité, par exemple au Conseil européen, là, je peux trancher et prendre mes propres responsabilités. Donc, et il a utilisé cette possibilité à plusieurs reprises. Donc oui, bien sûr, c'était contre l'avis de son ministre des Finances, absolument.
Aber am Schluss, nachdem auch die Kriterien alle akzeptiert worden waren, schien es uns vertretbar, weil ja ein langer Konvergenzprozess von fast einem Jahrzehnt vor uns stand.
Under the community's rules, the EMU treaty had to be agreed unanimously. This gave considerable leverage to countries which wanted to opt out.
We have made it absolutely clear throughout the whole of these discussions that there is no possibility whatsoever of the United Kingdom committing itself now either to whether or when it will enter into a single currency. Without such an agreement, there will be no agreement to the Economic and Monetary Union Treaty.
The British opt-out would be negotiated by Norman Lamont, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, with his fellow finance ministers, who were meeting separately. At the last possible moment, Lamont handed over a long and complicated opt-out protocol to be added to the treaty. The Dutch presidency took this to be a wrecking tactic.
I was not prepared to have our opt-out drafted by other countries. We had agreed the general framework of EMU, which we were unanimous about. The opt-out was something for Britain and Britain alone, and what we were opting out from was a matter for us and for nobody else, and I said that that was not negotiable.
He took a position just to gain time, to make problems, and so on, what I call filibustering. He was doing that.
The Dutch Prime Minister feared his treaty was under threat.
The agenda of Lamont was to kill the single currency project. So I took John Major and I said, listen, you know, we need the decision now on single currency with a British opt-out. It's as clear as that. I cannot accept that your Minister of Finance is filibustering here. We're running out of time. We need a decision now. So this is where we are. And then he had a separate word with his Minister of Finance, Lamont, and that was the end of it. I mean, not of Lamont, but of his filibustery. We can be sure at the same time that in the course of a limited number of years, in the course of the 90s, we'll have that one currency.
But European leaders hadn't bargained for the eruptions of hostility which the planned single currency provoked. 6 months after the Maastricht summit, Danish voters in a referendum rejected economic and monetary union. This galvanized opposition in other member states.
With the Danish referendum, doubts spread. That was the crucial date. Doubts as to the future of monetary union. Everybody was sort of flabbergasted what had happened. What was going to happen now? The Danes said, we have no answer, and nobody else had.
European leaders tried to shrug off the Danish referendum. But they couldn't shrug off a second threat to EMU, which arose from Germany's own financial difficulties. Enter Helmut Schlesinger, rigorous defender of the Bundesbank's duty to preserve the value of the Deutschmark. Faced with mounting inflation, he repeatedly jacked up interest rates.
Wir sind zu einem Umschlag unserer Zahlungsbilanz gekommen. Wir sind zu einer unglaublichen Ausweitung der Staatsverschuldung gekommen. Wir waren in einer Situation, wie es sie für die Bundesrepublik Deutschland und Alt, mit Ausnahme vom Jahr 1950-51, nicht gegeben hat. Also für uns stand das nicht zur Debatte.
High German interest rates led speculators to buy marks and sell other currencies. But all the European Union currencies, including the pound sterling, were members of the exchange rate mechanism, the ERM. Its purpose was to hold exchange rates stable. As the value of the mark went up, that of weaker currencies went down, making it hard for them to stay within the mechanism. Now came the first in a series of desperate attempts to push the Germans into taking responsibility for the survival of the ERM. For the first time, all the main participants describe what happened. Norman Lamont was to chair a meeting of European finance ministers and central bank governors in Bath. He intended to take on both the president of the Bundesbank and the German finance minister. They could see evidence of the recession. They knew that Lamont needed to cut British interest rates, and to enable him to do so would press them hard to cut German.
Since this was what the screenplay said, I felt I had to act out the part, and I had to put this proposition to them. I think when you're in the last chance saloon, it's worth pressing anything.
Norman Lamont bat uns Deutsche am Tisch eine Zinssenkung durchzuführen. Ich habe dann kurz erläutert, dass das nicht gehe und dass der Zentralbankrat am Tag zuvor beisammen gewesen sei und keine Zinssenkung beschlossen habe, die Bundesregierung darauf keinen Einfluss habe.
Well, that was the view the board of the Bundesbank had taken. But we were members of an exchange rate mechanism which was meant to be a hard ERM, meant to be paving the way for more European solidarity. Surely that meant people had to take account of other people's interests.
Hat gefragt, ob nicht ich, der Notenbankpräsident, den Lombardsatz am nächsten Montag, es war ja Samstag, am nächsten Montag um 0,25% senken könnte. Und ich musste ihm, nachdem diese Frage dreimal gestellt hat, dreimal die Antwort geben, dass das nicht möglich ist.
Cock crows 3 times.
Als dann die Frage nochmal auftauchte, da merkte ich plötzlich, dass also Präsident Schlesinger wütend war und am liebsten den Raum verlassen wollte.
Ich machte auch eine Bemerkung zu dem Finanzminister, Herrn Weigel, und sagte ihm, sodass das niemand sonst hörte, auf Bayerisch, Herr Weigel, ich glaube, es ist besser, ich gehe jetzt. Daraufhin antwortete Herr Weigel, lassen Sie mal, ich mache das jetzt.
Aber ich sagte, Norman, du hast jetzt 4-mal die Frage gestellt. Du darfst sie noch einmal stellen, aber dann ist Schluss. Und als er mir dann sagte, dann muss ich sie morgen nochmal stellen, sage ich, das kannst du, nur ich muss heute noch heimfahren. Es wird keinen Sinn mehr machen. Die Frage ist entschieden. Und ich bitte jetzt keine weiteren Fragen in der Richtung zu stellen. Und dann war auch Schluss.
À trop vouloir bien faire, M. Lamont avait fini par gâcher une occasion, une situation qui avait bloqué tout d'un coup les positions des uns et des autres.
The Bundesbank president left Bath having promised nothing. 9 days later, he was at the center of an even bigger storm. Massive speculation against the lira had forced the Italian government to devalue. And that evening, there were reports that Dr. Schlesinger had hinted at further devaluations. that could only mean the pound.
I got a telephone call from the Chancellor, who was dining at the American Embassy, and told me what had happened. And he said to me, "Can you ring up Schlesinger?" And I said, "Of course I will."
Governor Lee Pemberton rief mich vielleicht 10 Uhr oder so etwas an und sagte, da läuft etwas über den Bildschirm und da steht, dass ich gesagt habe, ich würde die Abwertung weiterer Währungen für richtiger gehalten haben.
Schlesinger was very apologetic in the sense that he said, "I don't think that I've done anything very prejudicial. This was an off-the-record remark. It was not supposed to be published. And I'm very disappointed that it has been."
I like Dr. Schlesinger, I have nothing against him, but I think he's a rather innocent, naive character, and frankly, his interview was a disgrace. I mean, he just said the pound ought to be devalued, which was no business of his to say.
Subsequently, I had to ring him again and say, "Well, do you think you could do your best to, what's the word, recall this, correct it?"
Ich sagte ihm also, lieber Robin, ich kenne das Zitat gar nicht, wovon es sich handelt. Ich bin zu Hause, ich habe kein Fernseh, kein Medium hier, ich muss das sehen. Ich kann ja auch nicht etwas dementieren, was ich möglicherweise gesagt habe.
The newspapers next morning were quite sure what the Bundesbank president had said. On the London money markets, the pound dived. Only an interest rate hike might prevent a free fall. Having long wanted to reduce rates, the government now increased them from 10% to 12%.
My memory of Black Wednesday is one of increasing anxiety and finally despair. I went backwards and forwards from my office to the Prime Minister's room in Admiralty House 3 times at least, I think. I reached the private conclusion, probably in the middle of the day, that we were not going to be able to stop this.
In the last 15%. 15%? What? 15%?
Another huge interest rate increase in the early afternoon had no effect either. For the second time that day, the governor of the Bank of England rang the governors of other European central banks.
I was saying to them, unless you can help us, we're going to have to leave the ERM. And they all listened. And both France and Germany said, well, we aren't going to commit resources to help you. And I said, well, I'm sorry, we'll hold out till the markets close in London, and then we're coming out.
My strongest memory is of the end, and just telling the press we had withdrawn from the ERM. But it wasn't a moment I had ever anticipated.
Today has been an extremely difficult and turbulent day. Massive speculative flows have continued to disrupt the functioning of the exchange rate mechanism.
It was a moment of defeat, but also a moment of some relief.
In the meantime, the government has concluded that Britain's best interests are served by suspending our membership of the exchange rate mechanism.
I think I probably did not appreciate enough what impact this had and what a reversal this was for the government. I mean, as far as I was concerned, I thought the ERM had gone on long enough. I mean, I don't mean that I, other than was very determined to maintain the government's policy, but I felt a certain release that it was all over.
The single currency project depended not on Britain, but above all on France and Germany. Attention now turned to President Mitterrand, who had announced a referendum on the Maastricht Treaty. He believed that a clear victory would tie his successors to the single currency. But as referendum day approached, polls were reporting that the president might lose. In the event, he won, but by a very narrow margin. He claimed victory, but the markets read it as a defeat.
It's just
The franc now came under sustained pressure. If it went the way of the pound and had to leave the ERM, the single currency and all the plans for EMU would be in jeopardy. European finance ministers and central bank governors were in Washington for a conference. It was now the turn of the French to beg Dr. Schlesinger for help.
Oui, on l'appelait casque à pointe chez nous, qui veut dire prussien, avec un esprit très autoritaire. Schlesinger est donc, je dirais, d'une école, une vieille école, qui est l'école, il est issu de la Bundesbank, etc. Donc c'est l'école suivant laquelle la Bundesbank est là pour préserver les intérêts de la monnaie allemande et ne doit se préoccuper que de la situation allemande.
Das war die Grundlage der Zustimmung der Bundesbank zum europäischen Währungssystem. Dass wir von der Interventionspflicht befreit werden, wenn diese Interventionspflicht es für uns unmöglich macht, unseren Stabilitätsauftrag weiter zu erfüllen.
The French had a novel solution to their crisis. They asked for a Franco-German communiqué, proclaiming the determination of both countries to defend the franc. This had never been tried before.
M. Schlesinger restait sur une position allemande en disant c'est chacun nos oignons, quoi, hein. Chacun ses problèmes, avec une grande crainte, je crois, dans la tête de M. Schlesinger, c'est si je signe ce communiqué et que les marchés continuent, c'est ma crédibilité à moi, Banque centrale allemande, qui est mise directement en cause. Si les marchés me battent, qu'est-ce que je vaux ensuite, quoi, hein? Qu'est-ce que je pourrais faire ensuite?
Ja, das Gefühl ist nicht so falsch gewesen. Es ehrt unseren Gesprächspartner, Herrn Sapin, dass das Gefühl hatte.
Whilst the French and Germans were locked in combat in Washington, Chancellor Kohl was weaving his way down Paris boulevards to see his friend François Mitterrand. Would the Chancellor overrule his proud and independent central bank? This was a decisive moment for EMU.
Donc c'était un moment absolument névralgique. La Banque de France, à force d'intervenir jour après jour, ne pouvait plus vendre du marque. Il n'y avait plus de possibilité de vendre plus de marques. Donc ça a été la rencontre un petit peu de la dernière chance.
Mitterrand was convalescing after an operation for cancer.
Il est arrivé donc pour une rencontre, pour voir comment son ami François allait. Et c'est la première question qu'il lui a posée. Il y a eu une conversation comme ça, un petit peu badine, pendant une demi-heure. Et puis le président lui a dit, écoutez, cher Helmut, il faut que je vous dise, la situation est extrêmement grave. Moi, j'ai décidé de ne pas dévaluer. Il n'est pas question que le franc dévalue. Nous sommes attaqués par la spéculation. Nous n'allons pas pouvoir résister tout seuls. Donc, est-ce que vous êtes avec nous ? Nous avons décidé ensemble de faire la monnaie unique européenne. Aujourd'hui, c'est le jour du jugement. Le chancelier était très surpris. Il dit, mais attendez, François, je n'ai pas ces informations.
It was Helmut Kohl's style to give little away, but he acted promptly.
Alors, il est passé dans mon bureau à côté, il a essayé de joindre son ministre des Finances, qui était encore à Washington.
Der Kanzler telefoniert, tut halt etwas, helft halt mal, nicht? Aber so ganz einfach war das nicht. Und es gibt ja auch ganz klare Entscheidungskompetenzen der Bundesbank, nicht? Und das war eine ganz schwierige Situation in Washington.
J'ai utilisé le standard et bon, j'ai fait l'opératrice en l'occurrence pour lui trouver toutes les personnes comptables de l'autre côté de l'Atlantique.
Ja, also ich frage, wie steht's nun, wie weit seid ihr nun oder so etwas, wird er gefragt haben und ich werde ihm berichtet haben, ja, wie es steht, nicht wahr? Ja, ich habe ihm sicherlich auch gesagt, und im Übrigen, das ist nicht nur unsere Sache, das ist auch Sache der Franzosen. Die müssen auch mithelfen. Das hat gar keinen Sinn, wenn die nicht selber was zeigen.
Ces pauses durant laquelle, j'imagine, a eu lieu le contact entre le chancelier et M. Weigel et M. Schlesinger, on a vu revenir un président de la Bundesbank dans des dispositions d'esprit différentes, pas jovial, il ne l'a jamais été, mais moins hostile, un peu plus bougon, et disant, bon, j'accepte, mais c'est bien parce que le gouvernement allemand me le demande.
Es war schon ungewöhnlich, dass wir ein solches Kommuniqué mit unterschrieben haben. nicht wahr? Das ja also unsere eigene Glaubwürdigkeit mit ins Spiel brachte, nicht wahr?
The French got their joint communiqué, and the speculators, facing the might of the Bank of France and the Bundesbank, pulled back. Chancellor Kohl had lent on the Bundesbank to save the franc. He had not intervened to save the pound sterling in the run-up to Black Wednesday.
The French-German axis did, of course, appear more crucial to the prospect of going ahead with EMU. And the British had more or less declared already they would not want to be part of EMU as far as one could see in Maastricht. But if the French-German axis had broken, then EMU would have broken at that time.
Once again, political will had triumphed. But this particular Franco-German deal turned out to be little more than a quick fix. Less than a year later, the franc was in trouble again. A high-handed comment by a French minister on excessive German interest rates had set off a worldwide wave of selling the franc. Fearful French officials asked their German counterparts to another secret meeting in Paris.
Nous étions allés chercher la délégation allemande dans un véhicule monospace, tout simplement pour avoir une seule voiture et faire tenir le plus de monde possible dans la même voiture et donc réduire les problèmes de sécurité et de surveillance. Et pour avoir une arrivée discrète, puisque cette réunion n'était pas censée être connue. Et dès le départ, visiblement, le fait pour la délégation allemande d'être transportée dans une belle voiture, une Renault Espace, mais qui n'était pas une voiture de luxe, a posé un problème, un tout petit peu terni l'atmosphère.
Nein, ich habe nicht vergessen, dass wir sehr kühl empfangen worden sind. Zum Beispiel, dass wir mit einem kleinen Bus vom Flugplatz zum Finanzministerium gefahren worden sind, ohne jegliche Begleitung, sodass wir ständig im Verkehr drin steckten, während es sonst üblich war, dass man also die berühmten Motards bekam, um durch den verstopften Pariser Verkehr zu kommen. Und wir wollten ja früh da sein. Wir wollten ja da sein und etwas mit den Franzosen erreichen, bevor die Börse gelaufen ist.
Well, it was a dramatic meeting in the sense that money was pouring out by the second. And that was the situation in which we were, and was particularly uncomfortable for us.
By the end of that day, the Bank of France had spent 150 billion francs, their Black Friday. Now the French wanted the Bundesbank to promise to buy any francs offered them.
Nous demandions effectivement des interventions illimitées, tout simplement parce que ce sont les règles du club.
Es gab einen Punkt, wo man der Bundesbank das Recht zuerkennen muss, nicht unbegrenzt zu intervenieren, wenn das keinen Sinn mehr macht. Und der Punkt war erreicht, und das habe ich auch der französischen Seite klipp und klar annonciert.
For Mr. Schlesinger to allow intervention to result in an ejection of something like 90 billion Deutschmark was something that would normally have made him jump out of the window.
Das Entscheidende war, wir können am Montag